Welcome back to Proxy Hammer, everybody. And today we're going to take a long look at the Eldar Craftworld Exarch Powers. And we're going to kind of talk about a few points. We're going to, talk about their uses. And we're also going to talk about which ones are the most competitive and which ones seem to be the most powerful. And the good news is that most of them are usable now. None of them are completely useless, but there are some that are stronger than others. So let's dive right in. So first up to bat is the Crimson Hunter. So honestly, I used to be a fan of the Crimson Hunter back in the day when flyers were, very, very powerful. This was a great answer to a lot of, flying circuses and so forth. But to be honest with you, in this current state of the game, flyers aren't that strong. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and look at the different powers that are available to the Crimson Hunter. So first up, we have Eyes of Cain, which basically makes it so that you automatically hit targets that can fly. Now, I'm going to be real with you here, okay? This is not the best type of power, and the reason for this is not because it's not a good ability. It's because the Crimson Hunter Exarch already has Ballistic Skill 2+. So he's basically hitting on everything but ones anyway. So, to be honest, auto hits are really cool, but it's only against models with a fly special rule. Now, I could see this being really good against other flyers, which is kind of probably what this is meant for. And to be honest with you, looking at the other abilities, it's probably the best one on the list. But, it's debatable whether it helps that much. I mean, in some cases it could, be very useful, but in other cases kind of a little more on the useless side. And again, if you're somebody who doesn't like to take risks, this is a great Exarch power to have. Because, if you're somebody who rolls a lot of ones, I've been there too, trust me. This is great because you could just auto hit if the unit has fly. Decent Exarch power. Now, the next one is Strafing Assault. And this is the one that I'm kind of iffy about. And the reason I'm a little bit iffy about it is because all it does is it basically nullifies any effects of cover that the enemy might have. The issue with this is that normally, bigger stuff isn't really going to be benefiting that much from cover in general, maybe +1 to their armor. But if you have Bright Lances, armor's not going to mean that much. So Strafing Assault, not really that great. But it can be useful, especially since sometimes, you'll be firing infantry if you choose to have star cannons. Maybe you're firing at some heavy infantry and, they'll be in cover, maybe dense cover or something like that. And they'll get a -1 to hit penalty. You'll get a -1 to hit penalty, and then that would be useful in that situation. But, altogether, Strafing Assault, probably not the targets you should be going for, are targets on the ground. And the last one is Swooping Evasion. And actually, believe it or not, I think Swooping Evasion is one of the better skills. And here's why. Yes, it's only a 5+ invulnerable save, but that's already on top of a -1 to hit. So enemies are not only, they're -1 to hit. Now you have a 5+ invul save. These things add up and make it harder for enemies to deal with the flyer, which is essentially pretty squishy otherwise. So I actually think Swooping Evasion isn't a bad Exarch ability. Helps keep it alive for longer, makes it harder for people to use things like, last cannons, missile launchers, single-shot weapons that deal a lot of damage. Gives you a chance to save against those. And in my view, that's pretty good. So Swooping Evasion, probably one of the better ones out of the group. And if you do use a Crimson Hunter, I would use either that one or Eyes of Cain if you want to go after flyers. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about Dark Reapers. So Dark Reapers are a unit that saw a pretty big nerf. Well, not super big, but a sizable nerf in the new edition. So they have a couple of Exarch powers. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be a little critical of these. And it's not because the powers aren't good themselves. It's because it's replacing powers that were, to be honest, the same, if not better before. So let's go ahead and talk about power, which is Bringer of Death. So basically what this does is if the model is armed with a Reaper launcher or shuriken cannon, it can shoot an additional time. Make one additional attack with that weapon. If the Exarch is armed with a Eldar missile launcher or Tempest launcher, you can ignore enemies. Well, basically what happens is you can ignore cover with that model. So if you're shooting at an enemy, any benefits they would get from cover are nullified. So that means, -1 to hit or +1 armor. That's going to be nullified against that. So pretty decent, but to be honest with you, it's something that they had before and they got for free. And now they have to pay for it. So it's a little bit more of an issue this time around because it costs points now. Now the next one is called Focused Fire. So this basically means that your Dark Reaper Exarch basically can add 1 to the attack's wound roll every time he makes a ranged attack. So this is okay. I think this plays in better with things like the Tempest launcher. But my problem with this again is that, yeah, +1 to the wound roll is nice, but it's only the Exarch. So unless you're running a certain build, it's just not going to be that useful. And it's kind of debatable whether or not Focus Fire would be better than Bringer of Death, which in most cases would allow you to ignore an enemy's the benefits of cover. Now, here's the thing, though. Dark Reapers already ignore the -1 to hit. So in a board with a lot of light cover, yes, this could be very useful for negating armor, Bringer of Death, but basically both of these first powers struggle to actually make any real impact. In general, if I was only to choose between these two powers, I would typically bring Bringer of Death if you have a Eldar missile launcher, or excuse me, not Eldar missile launcher, sorry, a Reaper missile launcher, and you're never going to take a shuriken cannon, so that's out. But if you're taking a Reaper launcher, Bringers of Death is the answer. If you're bringing a Tempest launcher, Focus Fire is the better power there. And then, of course, they have a third power, Reaper's Reach. So this is, I wouldn't take this just on principle. It's kind of a slap in the face. It basically gives Dark Reapers what they had to begin with, which is they can move and fire in the same turn and not suffer the hit penalty. So yeah, in general, I don't really like it just, based on that. It's not really the best, to be honest, anyway. So, yeah. A little bit of a slap in the face that GW would take what they had originally and wrap it up and give it to us as an Exarch power that you pay points for. So again, not the best, but it's okay. It's not terrible, I have to say. It makes them a little more mobile and stuff like that, but it just, I think it's mostly the principle of it that irks me a little bit, that they used to have this base. So, and the other Exarch powers, to be quite honest with you, are certainly better at dealing damage. Okay, so next up is Dire Avengers, probably one of the best units in the current codex right now, as far as our elites category. So the first one is Defensive Stance. Now, this is kind of a nifty ability because it allows you to shoot in combat. However, as cool as it sounds, I highly believe that it is actually a trap Exarch power. So let me explain what I mean by a trap Exarch power. So a trap Exarch power is an Exarch power that seems really powerful, right? It's very good. Wow, I can shoot in combat. That basically gives me the ability to do damage without actually having to worry about staying out of engagement range with enemy models, right? So this essentially allows you to attack twice, right? It allows you to shoot and with your regular attacks in combat also do damage. So very powerful altogether. But the reason why this Exarch power is a trap is because a vast majority of the time, if you're an experienced Eldar player, you know from experience that Dire Avengers are not good in close combat. I have personally lost close combats with Dire Avengers to Guardians. Excuse me, not Guardians. Imperial Guardsmen, okay? To Guardsmen. Your standard Cadian or Catachan. And it's true, the dice gods were not with me, but Eldar are very squishy. They do not do that well in combat. I know the fluff of Dire Avengers says they're supposed to be good in combat and in shooting. Don't listen to it. It's not really that true. So this is why it's a trap Exarch power. You don't want to actually be in combat because honestly, you're going to lose. You're going to be the one that's going to be charged, and you're probably going to die horrifically. So you won't really get the chance to use that Exarch power at all. All right, so that's why it's a trap. Now, the second one, on the other hand, is the best Exarch power, not only just for Dire Avengers, but I think for the whole codex. Shredding Fire. Every time you make a shuriken, basically a roll with the shuriken weapon on a 5+, the shuriken weapon takes effect instead of a 6. So that means that you're going to get much more AP -4, because remember, Dire Avengers have a slightly better weapon that has an additional armor penetration value. So this is fantastic. This increases your damage by a considerable amount. And the cool thing is, it stacks with other abilities that your Dire Avenger unit might be benefiting from. So Blade Storm, it benefits from Guide and Doom. Doom especially. So great Exarch power. It does cost a little bit, but it's worth it, especially if you give your Exarch dual shuriken catapults. And the last Exarch power, I actually like this one if you're planning on taking a second big unit of Dire Avengers, or even just a smaller unit. The reason why this is good is it gives the unit objective secured, and it's cheap. It's only 10 points. So giving this to a smaller squad or even a bigger squad might be a good idea, because that way you can have a single unit of Dire Avengers that can actually, compete and score over other units, no matter how many models are in the squad. So let's say that, your enemy has a squad of Terminators on an objective. Well, guess what? You can move your 5 Dire Avengers into contact with that objective, and you can capture that objective, right? Even if you have one Dire Avenger, even if just the Exarch is the only one standing in that unit, you can capture it over other elite and fast attack and heavy support choices because you have that objective secured. And it's not that many points. So in my mind, it's even though it doesn't do more damage, it does help the unit capture objectives and earn points towards your victory. So not a bad Exarch power, and because it's so cheap, in my opinion, if you're taking more than one unit of Dire Avengers, one of your units should definitely have Stand Firm on it. You can't really go wrong with it, and as an added bonus, it gives the models 1 extra leadership, so they're less susceptible to leadership checks. Okay, so next we have the Fire Dragons. Now, Fire Dragons are a great unit, but here's my opinion with Fire Dragons. I actually don't think they need any Exarch powers to be effective because their weapon is so strong. But let's go ahead and take a look at these anyway. A couple of them are worth noting. Blazing Fury adds 4 inches to the range characteristic of their fusion guns. And I actually think this is a great power. And the reason why is not necessarily because it does more damage or anything like that, but because it allows you to create more distance between yourself and enemy units, thus protecting them from assaults and things like that, which they're very vulnerable to. So think about it like this. Instead of being within 12 inches, you could be within 16. You could shoot, battle focus back an average of 3 inches, which will give you a 19-inch distance between yourself and any kind of opponents that are getting out of land raiders or any other transport. So a lot of the times, opponents will actually put close combat units in transports to try to get them closer quicker and protect them from shooting. So when Fire Dragons shoot at a transport, the assault units come out, and if you don't have an answer to those assault units that turn, your Fire Dragons are probably going to die. So Blazing Fury is a good way to create extra distance between yourself and the enemy and protect yourself from getting assaulted by those same troops. So the next Exarch power here is called Burning Heat. And this basically means that every time a unit in the, a Fire Dragon in the unit scores a hit, that automatically wounds a target. Okay, so here's a couple of things about this. So Fire Dragons already get rerolls on 1s to wound against vehicles and monsters. And against most targets, they're going to be wounding on 3s against tanks. Now, this is pretty good, but again, it requires you to get within 9 inches, which is pretty close. Now, this could be useful. Don't get me wrong. This could be useful power. But you have to weigh whether or not it's actually, it's actually worth it to you to get maybe 1 more wound, if anything, against a vehicle or a monstrous creature or anything like that. So, it's pretty good. I like the power myself. I think Burning Heat's cool. But again, if you're playing it safe and you don't want that Fire Dragon unit to die immediately, then it's probably better to be farther back. But it does have its uses. It's just, in most scenarios, I don't see it being useful enough to actually warrant taking on a unit of Fire Dragons. But again, if you're concerned about not doing enough damage, this can certainly help with that. And the last power on the list is Dragon's Bite. It affects the Exarch only, and to be honest with you, it's not that great. It gives +2 damage to the result if your Fire Dragon Exarch has a Fusion Gun or Fire Pike, and it adds 1 to the damage result if he has a Dragon's Breath Flamer, and it allows you to reroll the wound. It's garbage. It's never going to do as much damage as you think, and it's really not a great power. Because pretty much for the same cost as upgrading it with this power, there's a lot more things you can actually do with it. So it's not exactly the best. Now, if you're doing a Dragon's Breath Flamer, it could be useful. Because rerolling the wound with +1 damage can be really good against taking out infantry. But again, Fire Dragons are not meant to take out infantry. They're meant to take out tanks. And it really doesn't help that much with that. Okay, so next up we have Shining Spears. And Shining Spears are still one of the best units in the Eldar Codex. I wouldn't say they're as strong as they were before, comparatively, but they're pretty good. They're definitely a fast and hard-hitting unit, and they have 3 abilities. Now, they're all good in certain ways, but I'm going to go into the specifics of why I think the one I'm going to say is the best one. And it has nothing to do with personal opinion or preference or whatever, and has everything to do with the simple math of dealing damage to pretty much all types of enemies. So we'll go over them first, and then I'll tell you which one I think is best. And Expert Lancers is first. Expert Lancers, basically, when you make a charge, the unit can add 1 to the attack's hit roll. So this is pretty decent. But essentially, because the squad can't be more than 6 models, the actual ability is only going to generate 3 extra hits on average. Now, sometimes this could vary, dice gods, be damned or be praised, but in general, on average, it's only going to generate 3 hits. Now, this is pretty decent. It means you're going to get probably about 2 more kills against a Marine-style target, so it's pretty good. But the next one I'm going to talk about, called Heart Strike, is not only going to deal more damage, but they're going to be mortal wounds, so they're better at pretty much dealing with invulnerable saves and things like that. So the next one's called Heart Strike. It only affects the Exarch, but here's the catch here. Each time he makes a melee attack, an unmodified wound of 5+ inflicts 1 mortal wound in addition to normal damage. So here's where this comes into play. An Exarch with a Paragon Blade and the Heart Strike ability gets to reroll his hits. First of all, gets 6 attacks, gets to reroll his hits, reroll his wounds. That is going to be an insane number of potential mortal wounds. So on average, you get about 3 mortal wounds. And the great thing about this is that's in addition to the damage he's normally doing. Okay? So essentially what that means is that he's doing normal damage and he's doing mortal wound damage at the same time. So he'd probably generate about 3 normal wounds with about 3 mortal wounds. So what this means is that an Exarch with this ability So this is going to, on average, pretty much out damage the alternative, which is if the Exarch just kept the laser lance. Now, here's the thing. Some people might think, well, that's fine, but Heartstrike isn't really good with a laser lance or a star lance, and I want to give my Exarch a star lance. And that's perfectly fine. you can give your Exarch a star lance. That's perfect. But you also have to keep in mind that a star lance does cost extra points. It makes the unit more expensive. And even just keeping the laser lance, I mean, the laser lance is a great weapon. But you're going to want to, at some point, have something that deals reliable mortal wound damage. So, I mean, Heartstrike isn't for everybody, but it does do very well with the Paragon Saber. It's not a lot of points. It's actually cheaper than the Expert Lancer's ability as well. And I think in general, even if you do end up going with the Star Lance, I think it's still worth it to get Heartstrike just for a couple more mortal wound damage, or a couple more mortal wounds, because, you know, you are going to be going against units that do have invulnerable saves, and this can just add up over time. Whereas the Expert Lancers, yes, it's going to generate you about 2 more wounds, but you're not going to be able to ignore invuls with those wounds. And lastly, we have Lightning Attack. So Lightning Attack, basically instead of making a consolidation move of 3 inches, you can move 9 inches, an additional 6. This has great applications against enemies who like to bunch up with each other. But there's a danger to this. This is one of those Exarch powers that if you're not careful, it could be a trap. And here's why. When you consolidate into a different unit during your turn, if an enemy unit gets into contact with them and is now in their engagement range, that means they can fight. And you can't, because you've already fought that turn. So, let's say you're going against an army that's a little better in combat. Well, the Shining Spears are going to wipe out whatever they hit, right? Let's say they go against some Grey Knight intercessors or something like that. They're going to wipe them out, and then when they consolidate into another Grey Knight squad, guess what? They don't count as, they can't attack. They've already attacked that turn. So the Grey Knights are going to get to fight. And guess what? Grey Knights they just absolutely love taking jet bikes apart because their weapons do multiple wounds. So be careful what you use this on. It could be a trap if you don't have experience and you don't know who you're consolidating into. So it can be a great ability. Don't get me wrong. It can prevent them from being shot and things like that and can really muck up the enemy. But it can also lead to their very downfall. So be careful with it. So I told you guys I would tell you which one I think is the best. And personally, I think the best one is, and you probably guessed it from what I said, but Heartstrike. And the reason why, a lot of people might disagree with me on this, but I think Heartstrike is the best, not because, I think that, it's just this insane overpowered ability. It's because it retains its value even after you lose models. Because it's one of the few Exarch powers that actually produces extra damage, and that extra damage is almost equivalent to their unit ability, which is Expert Lancers. Actually, it's kind of a little bit more with the right setup. So what that means is that this is going to retain its value until the last model in the unit, which should be the Exarch, dies. Expert Lancers won't do that, and neither will Lightning Attack. And while both of those Exarch powers have their place and can definitely be used with some strategy and planning and so forth, to be honest with you, Heartstrike is just the most reliable. It's the one that is, kind of more generalized. It will always be in effect until the last model in the unit dies. So that's why I think it's actually kind of a hidden gem, really, and the best Exarch power to take on a unit of Shining Spears. Alrighty, so next we have the old Howling Banshees. So we have our favorite, kind of don't mess with these girls kind of unit because they will kill you and slit your throat in your sleep. So I'm just kidding. Howling Banshees are pretty good this edition in general. They're really good at taking out the targets that they were always meant to take out, which is very high armor, somewhat high toughness infantry, at least up to toughness 4 and 5. So here's the thing about the Banshee abilities. When you look at them, Graceful Avoidance, the first one, basically gives them a 4+ invul save in combat. And terrible. And I'm going to tell you why it's terrible. Howling Banshees are a unit that want to hit an enemy unit and kill them that same turn. Now, this can be done with support because Banshees, to be honest with you, smaller units of Banshees definitely can't. And even large units of Banshees will have trouble killing a full unit of 10 Space Marines or, 5 Terminators. They're still going to have trouble with it. They're going to do a lot better than they have in the past, but without support, they're going to have issues. So they're not going to kill them fully. Now, there's 2 ways to run Howling Banshees, and I'm going to go into that in another video when I specifically talk about Howling Banshees and their uses. But basically, there's 2 ways to run them. You can run them as a max damage dealing unit, or you can run them as a minimum utility unit. But either way, you don't really care too much about the 4+ invul save because you shouldn't be fighting another round of combat. And a good opponent won't let you stay in combat. They'll fall back with whatever's left of their unit and they will shoot the Howling Banshees. And what this means is essentially you're paying a lot of points for something that's not going to be able to be used against better players. So not a very great ability. I think it's a good ability on things like Witches for Dark Eldar, because Witches actually might be engaged in combat multiple rounds because that's kind of what they do. They hit an enemy and they grind them down. But Howling Banshees are not like this. They're not the same in that way. Now, the next one is Nerve Shredding Shriek. And Nerve Shredding Shriek is a little bit interesting. Basically what it is when you charge in, the Exarch model rolls a dice. If it's a 2+, the enemy suffers 1 mortal wound, and they have to subtract 1 from their combat attrition test taken. Okay, so it's interesting, but to be honest with you, it's not the greatest, and here's why. Most units in the game now that you hit with a unit of Howling Banshees, unless you're a new player or roll really bad, that unit should die. So combat attrition tests are just not very useful for Howling Banshees, and only dealing 1 mortal wound on a 2+ at that is just not worth it to me. Now, Piercing Strikes, on the other hand, is probably one of the best Exarch powers available in general, not just for Howling Banshees, but in general, and here's why. So the reason Piercing Strikes is good is because what it essentially does is it allows you to more effectively deal with, Space Marines and stuff like that, because most Space Marines have 2 wounds. So this turns the Exarch into, kind of middling damage dealer into a monster at dealing with Space Marines and Space Marine equivalents. So there's 2 ways you can run this. You can run the Exarch as a killer of Terminators and stuff like that, models with 3 wounds, give it an Executioner, and just go to town on those types of models. Or you can give it the Mirror Swords, give it, which gives it more attacks, and just be able to mow through Space Marine after Space Marine after Space Marine. So actually, believe it or not, I actually think this. So the thing is Piercing Strikes, in my opinion, works best with the Mirror Swords. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, well, why not be able to kill Terminators? Because Mirror Swords basically double your attacks. Now, this normally wouldn't be that great because, well, Mirror Swords only deal 1 damage and they only have -3 AP. It's not that great. But when you give them damage 2, oh my god. All of a sudden, your Exarch is getting 9 attack. Yes, you heard me correctly. 9 attacks. And each attack is damage 2. Because basically what happens is, because the Mirror Sword's ability says you can roll 2 dice for every 1 attack, for every 1 hit roll you make, that basically guarantees, it's like sweep. It's like the sweep special roll. So you're getting double your attacks. So you have 4 base, you double it, and then you get 1 attack for being an Exarch. with an upgraded ability. So that's phenomenal. That turns your Exarch into a killing machine. And it allows Howling Banshees to keep at a small, unit. You don't need a lot of Howling Banshees. You only need 5 or 6 to be able to, basically reliably kill, 5-man squads of Primaris Marines or Grey Knights or whatever it is. And just basically go to town. So Piercing Strike's probably one of the best abilities for the Howling Banshee Exarch just because of the raw damage it can put out. It's really a great ability. And in fact, it so overshadows the other two that I almost think like they need to go back to the drawing board on those and maybe like think about them again, because Piercing Strikes is pretty much an auto include. If you have a Howling Banshee unit in your army, you're going to go with Piercing Strikes. There's just no other way those other two abilities are worth anywhere close to what that is. So, next up we got Striking Scorpions, and Striking Scorpions, I think their Exarch powers are a little bit lackluster in a way, but I think there's also ways of making them, effective. So, I know what GW was doing with this, because to be honest with you, Striking Scorpions are one of the best combat units in the Codex, but unfortunately the Exarch powers have a lot to be desired. So let's go ahead and get into these. So Crushing Blows basically means that every time the Exarch makes an attack and hits, he auto wounds. So this is fantastic because what you can do is you can get a Biting Blade and you can auto wound. Now, here's the problem with this auto wound. It doesn't count as a 6 to wound for obvious reasons, but that means the Mandiblasters just don't work. And that's a shame because you lose part of the model's ability by doing that. But Crushing Blows is a way of basically guaranteeing wounds even on tough targets. Like, sometimes characters and stuff like that will be extra tough. They'll be toughness 5, toughness 6. In this way, you don't care, basically. You'll automatically wound every time you hit. And it also allows the Striking Scorpion Exarch to be good against, kind of other multi-wounded units that maybe have a little bit of higher toughness. Now, the second ability is Deadly Ambush. So this means while the unit is fully in area terrain, every time an attack is made against an enemy unit, you can add 1 to your attack roll, your hit roll, and you can add 1 to your armor penetration characteristic. So this can make them really good at dealing with certain things, especially things like characters and stuff like that, and being able to assassinate characters, which is one of the things that Striking Scorpions do so well. But it is situational, and, a good opponent will probably not let you do this. If he knows that you have Striking Scorpions in reserve, he'll probably keep his characters out of terrain. A lot of characters don't really care too much about terrain, to be honest with you, in this edition. In past editions, maybe they would, but in this edition, a lot of characters have inbuilt invulnerable saves. So that means that this is situational, and it might not always work out to your advantage. But if you're running a max unit or even just a minimum unit and want to be able to ambush things that are in terrain already, yeah, it's a great ability. I just don't think it's just not that good because it's situational. And when you're in a competitive scene, players aren't going to give you freebies all the time. If they know what you're running, because they'll probably ask you about what you're running beforehand, they'll know to keep their characters and other high priority targets out of terrain. And lastly, we have the Scorpion Sting ability, and basically instead of a 6 to wound, it makes with melee attacks to get the Mandiblasters effect, it's 5+. And see, I like this, but the problem is it really doesn't add too much to what the unit already has. It's only going to generate a couple of extra wounds max. And in my humble opinion, it's just not as good as either Deadly Ambush or, to be honest with you, Crushing Blows. I think both of those are a little more reliable Deadly Ambush, maybe not so reliable, situational, but much more powerful. And this ability really just doesn't add a lot. So unlike Heart Strike as well, the Exarch doesn't really have any way of gaining easy rerolls on his attacks. So to make the most out of this ability, you would need to hit a unit that you've already, you've already guided the striking scorpions and you've doomed the enemy unit. And if you can do that, yeah, Scorpion Sting is going to pay for itself for sure. But if you haven't done that, and you don't want to invest a lot in the unit, maybe you're just running it as an assassination squad for characters and other small units, then Scorpion Sting is just not going to be that effective for you. Okay, so next we have the Swooping Hawks. And the Swooping Hawks are a pretty good unit in this edition. I don't think they're anywhere as near as cost-effective, though, as they were before. I think they've improved their weapons quite a bit, but the lack of a Swooping Hawk grenade pack that's outside of stratagems is, well, it's a little bit of a bummer. But in any case, they have some pretty good Exarch powers. So let's go ahead and look at the few that they have. The first one up is Rapid Redeployment. So this one is not good, and I'm going to tell you why. You're never going to be able to use this power unless the opponent has some sort of crafty way of deep striking in and assaulting you, and somehow by a miracle you survive it. It's really not going to be effective. You're not going to be able to use it, and the models that do survive it are going to just probably be the Exarch, and that's it. And so that means if he falls back that turn, that model that's left, the survivor, the lone survivor, will be able to actually shoot. But again, rapid redeployment, not the greatest ability, to be honest. The next one is Suppressing Fire, and this one's pretty good. Basically, it when your Exarch targets a unit, you roll 3d6. If it exceeds the leadership, that unit cannot perform actions. So that unit can't overwatch, they can't set to defend, or any other actions or special actions that they have, they cannot use those anymore. So this is a pretty good ability, but it's determinant on a good roll. You need to roll higher than the unit's leadership, which on average you will do, but if you have a bad roll or something like that, there's nothing you can really do about it because it doesn't fall under the Strands of Fate, and you're kind of just out of luck. Unfortunately, I wish things were different, but that's the way it is with Suppressing Fire. It's kind of luck based, but it is pretty good. If you have a Swooping Hawk squad and your goal is to use them as a disruptor, this is a great Exarch ability. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, it's not going to do extra damage or anything like that, but it can prevent overwatch and it can prevent units from doing certain actions, and this can be very effective at disrupting your opponent's plans. Now, the last Swooping Hawk Exarch power is called Winged Evasion, and it basically just means that they're a little harder to hit. If they try to shoot you, they're at -1 to hit, as long as it contains the Exarch. So this is pretty good. It's kind of straightforward. It just makes the unit a little more survivable. However, I would argue that with good Skyleap placement, your opponent really shouldn't be able to shoot them anyway. But, it's good for those long-range artillery units or, kind of units that can ignore line of sight. It's good at mitigating the damage of that. I just don't know for a fact how effective it would be. Now, Swooping Hawks do get +1 ballistic skill, and, they still get the +1 wound for having an Exarch, or the Exarch gets it, I guess you could say. So it's worth taking it as an Exarch power. I think this is probably the second best, and I think the best one would be Suppressing Fire. Just because of its raw ability to just make an opponent not be able to do any actions. I know that doesn't seem that great on paper, but once you're playing in tournaments and once you're doing match play games, you'll really see how frustrating that can be for your opponent when they're performing an action and your Swooping Hawk squad just says, actually, nope, you're not going to perform that action anymore. I'm going to make you fail it automatically. So pretty good wrench in people's plans, and, great Exarch power overall. All right, and last but not least, we have the Warp Spider. So the Warp Spider's abilities, they're really not that great. And the reason why is because they're really situational. So what I don't like about some of the Exarch powers is that they're too situational for any kind of competitive use. But let's go into it really quick. So the first one we have here is called the Spider's Lair. Now, that unit moves within it or a unit moves into it or something like that, that unit suffers D3 mortal wounds in damage. Okay, so here's essentially what that means. If you have an objective on that piece of area terrain, or if there's an objective in it, it's going to make it a lot harder for your opponent to get at that objective. So one squad of warp spiders can totally ruin somebody's plans of getting to an objective in time to score on it. And essentially what it does is this. It says, okay, you can enter this piece of terrain, but every time you move within it, you're going to take damage. So either you're going to take a bunch of damage and go for the objective, or you're going to ignore the objective and let me capture it. So it's a very powerful ability. The only issue with it is you have to be skilled to use it. You can't just use it whenever, because a good opponent, if you use it too early, can just ignore it and just say, okay, well, all right, I'm just not going to move in that terrain this turn. So you really have to use it on critical turns, like turn 5 or turn 4 when, your opponents are kind of getting desperate to get, victory points and things like that. You kind of have to use it strategically, or when you notice your opponent's about to make a move on an objective, that's a good time to use your Spider's Lair ability. So overall, pretty good ability at controlling what your opponent does, and really good in objective style play and competitive play. Now the next one is called Surprise Assault. And basically what Surprise Assault does is whenever you use the Sudden Assault ability, you get to add 1 attack to each of your range attacks. So each warp spider gets D6 attacks. So with this, you're going to get D6 plus 1 attacks. So essentially 5 more attacks or 6 more attacks for the unit if you have an Exarch with an additional Death Spinner. Now, I actually think, though, that this is a worthless power, and here's why. Warp spiders are not about dealing a ton of damage, and even if they have pretty good weapons, but they're mostly a harassment and control unit. They're not a unit that's going to just alpha strike, and the reason why is because their weapons are good, but they're not the best at killing heavy infantry and things like that, because they really only have damage 1. And because they have the blast special rule, it's very clear that warp spiders are better at clearing out multiple light infantry units or bigger units than dealing with elites. So in general, Surprise Assault, I mean, it's a little bit of extra damage, but it's not really that great. And it definitely doesn't make up for the utility of the Spider's Lair Exarch Power, which I actually believe to be one of the best Exarch powers available to warp spiders. And lastly, we have the Web of Deceit. So this is actually really good too. Basically what it does is instead of making a battle focus move, it allows you to redeploy anywhere on the battlefield. So this is really good. This is like Skyleap for warp spiders, which, is very effective. This can basically, you can hit something on one side of the board and then transport to the complete opposite side of the board. So Swooping Hawks have this ability, but, Swooping Hawks don't really hit that hard. And because warp spiders hit a little bit harder than them, that means they can hit vulnerable, enemy positions a little bit harder and then do the exact same thing and pop to the other side of the board. So pretty good. Although I have to say, I still think that Web of Deceit is not the best. I still think that their other Exarch power is much better. Just the ability to, kind of set up in terrain and just web the whole piece of terrain with the Spider's Lair ability and make it harder for the enemy to move in it. First of all, make them slower. And second of all, just be able to, do mortal wound damage to anybody who enters is just too good to pass up in competitive play, especially in objective style play where, your opponents are really going to be going for those objectives every turn. Very powerful. And basically, when it comes to the Web of Deceit ability, if you want to play that game, I think the better unit to choose is just Swooping Hawks because they can do it every turn and they don't just do it once per battle. So, again, I think Warp Spiders are a very good control unit. I don't think you need many Warp Spiders, but one squad of 5 can really be useful in, doing that setup with the Spider's Lair. Saving them until the end of the game, bringing them in with, sudden assault, and then using the Spider's Lair ability to entrap a piece of terrain so that your opponent is going to take either a lot of damage or be unable to move through it and basically have to give up that objective for a turn, which could be very crucial and could mean the difference between losing a game and winning a game. So when thinking of Exarch Powers, in my opinion, that's the best one to choose with Warp Spiders. So in conclusion, I think most of the Exarch Powers do have applications. There's a few duds, obviously. There's a few that are just not great. But most of them have applications. But I have to say, when you actually read through, in competitive play, there are clear winners that, and there are clear winners in that. And then there are just must-take Exarch Powers that are much better than the rest and that will, carry you much farther in competitive play than others. So, for example, abilities like the Spider's Lair, Shredding Fire, Piercing Strikes, all of those really good Exarch Powers I told you guys about, those are going to be the must-takes in the unit. You're never going to see people not take those abilities on their Warp Spider units in the highest levels of competitive play. And to be honest with you, I mean, unless in maybe some rare cases you'd see people take something else depending on their list, but in most cases, some of the Exarch Powers are just far and above the rest. And I think I'm happy that a lot of the Exarch Powers did improve considerably. But what I'm not happy about is the fact that we still have this kind of, there's 3 Exarch Powers to choose from, but only, 1 or 2 of them are really going to be in contention. Some of them are just literally practically worthless in most scenarios, which is sad. But it's still a vast improvement to what we had before. And the other good thing is Exarch Powers now give your Exarch, at the minimum, an extra wound. And in most cases, an extra Blisk skill if it's a shooting aspect warrior, and an extra attack if it's a melee centric aspect warrior. Except for some reason, Warp Spiders get 1+ attack. Tell me how that makes sense. Anyway, so thanks for watching, everyone. I know that was a really long video. Usually my videos are shorter than that, but, I wanted to make sure that we just kind of covered all of our bases when it came to Exarch abilities. And I thought about doing this in 2 parts, but then I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it as one video. It's not a big deal. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will see you guys in the next one. There's more to come. I have some videos planned for a couple of different units. So thanks for watching.